Welcome to this week's edition of the Belau Report. I'm Jane Belau. This week we welcome Tim Penny, the president of the Southern Minnesota Initiative Foundation, former 1st District Congressman, co-chairman of the
Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget.
I wanted you to say that, co-chairman
It's a lot to
of
spit
the
out, isn't it?
Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. And boy, are you in the right place at the right time, right?
Well, I've been involved in budget issues ever since serving in Congress. And after leaving Congress, I was approached by two national organizations to serve on their board of directors. And one of them, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, tapped me to be one of their co-chairmen some years ago. And we do our best to try to keep budget discipline and budget responsibility on the front burner. But in Washington, it's hard to get the politicians to focus on doing the right thing because all of these budget decisions are tough and difficult.
We're going to do the good news first.
Oh, the Initiative
Then
Foundation.
we'll talk about the fiscal cliff, if there is a fiscal cliff, and we'll talk about what we need to do to take care of that national deficit that keeps growing, that you've been watching all these years.
Yep.
And trying to keep it down as small as you could.
Well, we've been trying, but the last several years we've been trending in the wrong direction, and it causes a lot of concern for those of us that are part of the Committee for a Responsible Budget, the Concord Coalition, and other groups, because for a while, in the late 1990s, it looked like we were finally heading in the right direction. We had a couple years of balanced budgets, and then everything came unraveled again.
Okay, first, the Southern Minnesota Initiative
Yeah.
Foundation. And you were in Olmsted County, and you've been visiting with all the counties in your region?
Yeah, virtually every county in the region gives us some level of support. So do a number of cities, corporations, banks, even individuals. We have a lot of individual donors. And that comprises about 8% of our foundation's annual budget. We have, in any given year, between $4.5 and $5 million worth of resources that we expend across a 20-county region here in south central southeastern Minnesota. So this time of year, as counties and cities and other groups are doing their budgeting, is a time that I go around and give a lot of reports on the recent work of our foundation. We divide our work almost evenly between entrepreneurial support, which includes some small business lending, but also some grants. We just gave a grant to the Chamber of Commerce here in Rochester to help them advance an entrepreneurial project. And then the other piece of our work is early childhood investment, some grant making, but a lot of partnerships with publishing companies, with IBM and their Young Explorer computers, with the AmeriCorps program, where we place these AmeriCorps personnel into early childhood sites. They become like a teacher aide within those sites to help get kids ready for kindergarten. So when you add it up, it's last year $4.7 million worth of resources that we expended across the region, and we raise about 8% of that budget from support within the region, and that's why I was at the Olmsted County Board giving my annual report just before I came to be interviewed by you.
And you announced 2 grants in the Rochester area.
Yeah, the one is to the Chamber of Commerce, which I mentioned just a moment ago. The other is actually going to go to the Children's Museum. You have a relatively new Children's Museum here in Rochester, another one over in Mankato. And both of them applied to us for an incentive grant this last fall, and we asked them if they couldn't work collaboratively and develop the same kind of a program for preschool-age children at both sites. And so we just announced that grant this past week. So we're excited about that.
Those are sizable amounts of
Well,
money.
it adds up. And we also gave a really big grant to 2 organizations. One organization is focused on the business model for early childhood. And they provide a lot of, it's called Children's First Finance, and they provide a lot of training so early childhood providers can improve their business model and be more financially successful in their business. But there's another organization that's focused on academic training to help preschool or daycare sites learn what it is that these kids are going to need to know by kindergarten so they can align their curriculum with those kindergarten expectations. And those 2 grants to those 2 organizations are going to reach upwards of 40 daycare providers in 2 counties, Steele County and Watonwan County, over the course of the next year. And that's a really big grant that we awarded at our annual luncheon last month. All told, that's $100,000 between those 2 organizations, but it's going to do a world of good for a number of daycare and early childhood providers in those 2 counties.
When you look backwards, to 2012, of what are you the most proud?
In the past year, I think, you know, that's a tough question, because I think we have a good model for leveraging limited grant dollars to big effect. But I think some of the things that I look back on in 2012 with the most pride are a new partnership that we developed with another publishing company. We've had a partnership with the Capstone Publishing Company for many years, and we have a great book start program that's announced typically in the spring, and then those books, 8,000 or more, are distributed during the summer months. But we created and developed a new program last year with another publishing company, Abdul. And that one is partnered with the 22 sites where we have an AmeriCorps person placed. And so the books go into those sites. They're used at the site. It's typically a series of books. Last year it was counting by 1s and 2s and 3s, so each book was a different denomination. And then we expect that the AmeriCorps person works with the teacher in the classroom to develop other programmatic activity, art activity or whatever it might be, to reinforce the message of the book. And at the end of the day, those books go home with the kids, and for most of these kids, there are not a lot of books in their household, so taking a book home that they own themselves is a big deal. So it's both got a classroom benefit, but also a benefit in the home of that child. And that's a new program that we created in partnership with Abdo Publishing last year, and we're very excited about it.
Now, do you have an advisory committee, a board at all?
Our board is comprised of 14 individuals from across the 20 county region, south central, southeastern Minnesota. And we try to have a mix of professional backgrounds on that board, and actually people with some expertise in the two areas of our primary work, which are early childhood, about 40% of our resources, and entrepreneurship, which is about 50% of our resources. Currently out of Rochester, we've got Carol Camper, who's been a community leader here in Rochester for many years, actually taught here at the community college for a number of years, and she's been a great asset to our board. She's in her final year of a 6-year tenure on our board, so we will be looking for another Rochester resident to replace her when she retires a year from now.
Now, you not only give money out, but
my point is that this board helps us determine our main areas of focus, and they of course, like all boards, have fiduciary responsibility for the work of the foundation, and it's to their credit that I think we've developed a good model for how we distribute our resources across the region.
I was moving from the policy part of it to the real world, and the real world part is you not only give away funds in grants, but you also receive funds. If people would like to leave a legacy or provide funding of some sort, you're happy to...
We have, as I mentioned before, we get about 8% of our budget from counties, cities, banks, corporations, and individuals. And there are couple different ways that individuals can be helpful to our foundation. One is to join our investor club. It's only $100 a year, and we have 100-some people that are part of that club where they give us an annual contribution. There are other individuals that give us more than $100 a year and some that give us less, but that's a club that you could join and become sort of a permanent partner with us and the work we're doing. And then there are folks, and each year we get additional people to sign up to think of us as a plan, as an organization that they would like to support through a planned gift. And all we really ask there is that it's not a contract; it's just a pledge. It's just an indication of intent, and so we don't have any legal right to that planned gift, but we know that people would not suggest to us that they're intent on giving us a planned gift unless they're going to do their best to honor that pledge, and so that's another way that you can be supportive of our foundation. There might be a third way, because we also manage the funds for 22 communities that have their own community funds. And just south of here, Spring Valley is one of those, Preston, Rushford, other towns across the region. And some of those community funds manage family funds. And so because they come under that community fund, we then help that community manage those dollars, invest those dollars, disperse those dollars as the community wishes or as the individual family wishes if it's a designated fund. So that's another way that people can give back to this region. They can either donate to us directly or they can donate through one of the community funds under our jurisdiction.
For example, the Rochester Foundation.
Yep. Well, they stand on their own. They're a freestanding fund.
But it is something.
But this is something, and people can do that, and they should, because the Rochester Area Foundation, with whom we partner on different projects, is a great foundation. But what we do is we become essentially the nonprofit 501c3 for 22 smaller towns across this region, so they too can have a community fund like the Rochester Fund.
We think of all the small communities that watch this program, and to know that there's a resource like that is great.
And we can connect them. If people are curious to know if they live in or near a community that has a community fund under our umbrella, just get a hold of us and we'll help you make that connection.
Okay, now here's a question that may segue into the second part of the program, but from the foundation's perspective, as you look at 2013, what do you think is going to be the greatest need of the foundation in the area it serves?
I think in the early childhood area, the greatest need is reaching those families who do not have their children, and I'm learning to follow the light, so we have the red light on over here. We have about 50% of our preschool-age children that are not in a structured or licensed facility where they're getting sort of an academic focus to get them ready for kindergarten. And so we're trying to focus more of our resources in the coming year, 2013, on groups and organizations that are doing a better job of reaching into these friend, family, neighbor, daycare type settings, so that we can get more resources into those settings, the books, the computers, the grants that would help provide for academic preparation for these preschool age kids. And we're also launching a Parenting Matters training course. And we've already got this course underway in Fairmont and soon to be underway in Waseca at a couple work sites in each town, where over the lunch hour, for 1 day a week over the lunch hour, for like a 6-week period, we go in and provide some parent training so that they then know how to go back to the friend, neighbor, family, whoever's caring for their kids while they're working, and give them the resources that are available within the community that they can access, and to make them fully aware of what your child needs to know at age 3 and age 4 in order to be on track to be ready for kindergarten. So we're beginning that, and we hope to grow that program over time. But I think in 2013, that's our big new ambition, is to do more work in that area.
You know, you talk about the value of the preschool education, and you started your career in the Minnesota legislature, and you've always had a lifelong interest in the education of children. Do you ever see a time in which the public education system will embrace early childhood education more than what they're doing now?
I think we're getting there. We're getting there gradually, because Minnesota for the last decade has had a tight state budget. And K through 12 education is 40% of that budget. And so, understandably, policymakers are focused on doing the best they can to maintain adequate levels of financial support for K through 12. And it means that a new initiative, like the early childhood area, is sort of getting what's left over. And so they have made some strides in improving funding for early childhood in the last couple legislative sessions, but there's clearly a lot more work that needs to be done there. We now have a Parent Aware for School Readiness rating system to rate local daycare and preschool providers to make sure that they are developing, using, and implementing curriculum that get kids ready for kindergarten. And we also have a modest state grant program or scholarship program to help low-income families afford to place their kids in these licensed centers that have that kind of academic programming. But it's a fraction of the need, and I know that there are more legislators every year that are interested in increasing the state's commitment to supporting early childhood, but we have a long, long way to go.
And here we have a budget that is still not paying back the schools what they borrowed from the schools.
Yeah, and that's going to be one of the first challenges for the state legislature. We'll know, I think, within a couple of weeks what the forecast is for the coming biennium. But every expectation is that the forecast will show that with current spending commitments, we're going to be about $1 billion behind. And that doesn't even account for the shift of almost $2 billion of school funding that is delayed until the start of the next fiscal year, so we can pretend that the current fiscal year is in balance. So when you factor that in, it makes a bigger hole that the state legislature needs to find a way to fill.
You know, when you think about it, it almost sounds too hard to tackle. And
it is.
now
it
let's
is big.
go to the federal level.
It is big, but it's not as bad as the federal level.
I know it.
There's at least hope at the state level. I'm beginning to lose hope at the national level.
You have been warning our viewers for 2 years as we've tried the quarterly programs to report both on your foundation and also on the federal level.
Yeah.
And you've been telling us that this day is coming, but it required someone to call it a fiscal cliff and say you're going to fall off in January to get people's attention.
Yeah, sometimes you have to, sometimes it's in how you package or message an issue. And I think Ben Bernanke, the head of the Federal Reserve, when he came up with this term fiscal cliff last summer, did us all a favor because he created a visual for the problem we face. And what we mean by the fiscal cliff is what's going to happen to the economy if all of the tax cuts go away overnight and all of the sequestration spending cuts go into place overnight. Now, that cliff occurs on December 31st, January 1. So Congress is now focused, well, beginning to focus. They're still putzing around, in my view, but they're now focused on this as the issue that they need to get resolved between now and the end of December, and that's great. The president has said that we really need to do something to avoid this cliff. One way you can look at this is that even if they don't reach a deal and the tax cuts go away, these are the Bush-era tax cuts as well as the Obama payroll tax cuts, and then the automatic spending cuts. But if the tax cuts go away, it's not as if we fall off the cliff economically overnight, because those tax cuts will result in higher taxes taken out of every paycheck for the next year. But that's about a 10% increase in your federal tax burden for every worker in America. So they're going to notice that. And the point is that over the course of the year, as people notice less take-home pay because now their federal taxes have gone up, they're going to cut back on spending. The economy will then slow. And most economists say that we will slow the rate of growth in our economy by at least a couple percent, if not 3 or 4%, just on that basis alone. And since we're only growing the economy at something around 2% right now, what does that mean? You could go into negative growth and you could have a recession by the end of the year. So that's the cliff everyone's worried about.
First, tell our viewers who haven't been following all of the activity over the last year, the rhetoric and reading all about the deficit and the growing debt to gross domestic product. I mean, tell them where we are.
We're not in a good place. Our annual budget is about $3.5 trillion. And for people that need to get their brains around $1 trillion, because it sounds a lot like a billion, it sounds a lot like a million. If you were to spend $1 every single second, it would take you, I believe, 11 days to spend $1 million. It would take you 32 years to spend $1 billion. It would take you 32,000 years to spend $1 trillion. We have a $3.5 trillion annual budget at the federal level. 35% of that, 1/3, a little more than 1/3 of that is borrowed money each year. So when we say we've got $1 trillion or $1.2 trillion annual deficit, that's roughly 1/3 of our total spending every year that's borrowed money. Here's the other tricky part. Because we've had huge deficits for the last several years, we now have a $16 trillion national debt, which is almost as big as our economy. And it's sort of like a house payment. You want to keep your house payment to maybe 30% of your annual income. You don't want your house payment to be 100% of your annual income. We're getting to a point where our federal debt is 100% of our nation's output, or close to it. And that's danger zone. And I don't think we want to risk the consequences of going there. So for all of those reasons, we need to find a way to begin reducing our annual deficit so that we can get control over the debt as well. And that's why people say, as we face this fiscal cliff, maybe trying to avoid the fiscal cliff is the threat or the crisis we need to cut a bigger deal on taxes and spending to get control over the federal budget. Does that all make sense?
Mm-hmm. It makes sense, but it's really a terrible problem.
And there's no easy. And the problem is there are no easy ways to deal with this.
Okay. Let me ask you a question.
On one side, frankly, the Democrats are very reluctant to put any serious spending cuts on the table, except perhaps the Pentagon. And on the other side, the Republicans have only recently said they're willing to put revenues on the table, but not rate increases. So there's been a lot of resistance to solving this problem with revenue from Republicans, and an awful lot of resistance on the Democratic side to solve this problem with spending cuts. And yet the problem is so big, honestly, we need to look at both sides of that equation.
You talked about the borrowing, but where does the money printing come in?
The money printing comes in when the federal government has trouble selling bonds to you or me, or for that matter, the Bank of China. And then the Federal Reserve steps in and says, well, we'll buy it. Well, how does the Federal Reserve buy it? They basically invent money. They create a new debt instrument in order to make sure that the government has money to pay its bills. And that's dicey. You can't have essentially an arm of the government creating money in order to buy up the government's debt. So, and I know the Federal Reserve doesn't want to keep doing this for very long, but they stepped in to do it because of the mess we've been in the last couple of years with the down economy and this huge debt burden.
The Federal Reserve was a creature of the banks, right? And its main
It was created by Congress, actually. Yes, go ahead.
Initially, its main jobs were to support the banks, be sure the banks were solid organizations.
That there's money flow in our economy.
Yeah. And then they got into something about employment, which broadened their
mandate. And that came in, I might be wrong about this. The Federal Reserve was created in the 19-teens, 100 years ago, because Congress was basically managing the American money supply up until then. And as much as people complain about the Federal Reserve, I don't think we want 535 congressmen managing our money policy, our monetary policy. So I'm okay with the idea that we've got a Federal Reserve that handles this for us. They are experts, and it's structured in an interesting way. There are Federal Reserve banks all across the country, and the people who lead those regional banks are part of a national federal open market committee that then establishes monetary policy for the country. I think it's a reasonably good structure, but at some point along the way it was decided that they shouldn't only manage kind of the money supply and the availability of money and you know, the functioning of the economy, because you got to have money to make things happen in the private sector. That they also wanted to influence the money supply in a way that created economic growth and kept unemployment at a certain level. And so that unemployment consideration is also now a piece of why perhaps they've been a little more generous with the money supply, because they see not just supporting the banks and the private sector as part of their mission, but they want to juice the private sector in order to do more and to create more jobs.
And at the same time impoverishing all these people who are savers by
no interest rates.
No interest? Yeah. I mean, okay, now we've got only
so there's always the flip side, and that's why I know that they don't want to stay on this path very long, because they're winners and losers. And while they're trying to stimulate the economy with low interest rates, they're also hurting people at a stage in their lives where they're trying to live off of their life savings, because they're now getting no return on those investments.
Wait until after the fiscal cliff. Okay, we only got 6 minutes to
flies.
Tell all our viewers what's going to happen. Probably, do you think that the Congress and the President will reach some sort of an accommodation?
They will do something before the end of the year. My guess is they will not come together with a grand bargain. We've talked at on previous programs about the Bowles-Simpson Commission, the bipartisan commission that recommended about $3 in spending savings over the next decade for every dollar in revenues. It's a balanced package. It acknowledges that the bigger problem is spending, but that you got to have revenue to fix the overall problem. And a lot of people have been running away from that, and a lot of folks, including my Committee for Responsible Budget, would love it if the Republicans in the House, the Democrats in the Senate, and the White House would get together on a plan similar to that before the end of the year, and then we can just say goodbye to this problem for a little while. I don't think they'll do that, but ultimately they need to come to that kind of an agreement on that size of a plan. What I think they'll do before the end of the year is agree to do something on taxes. They'll either extend all taxes, tax cuts for the foreseeable future, 3 months, 6 months, and give themselves more time to negotiate a bigger deal, or they may concede to Obama's demand that we raise taxes on the rich while letting everyone else's taxes stay down. But in exchange for that, I think the Republicans are going to have to ask, and they should ask, for a very clear and somewhat specific roadmap as to how we're going to achieve the $3 in spending cuts that we need in exchange for the revenue that we're going to get by taxing the rich. And so I think some kind of a deal will be reached before the end of the year, but I don't think it'll be the big deal.
In our communities where so many people are dependent on the health care jobs and the services provided by our health institution, and
I mean, watch out for this reason, because it's a big part of state and federal budgets between Medicare and Medicaid, and it's a growing part of those budgets. And now we've got Obamacare coming into play as well, and part of Obamacare, because it's a very expensive new entitlement, is going to be paid for by future cuts in the Medicare program. So we'll save money in Medicare in order to transfer, yes, and taxes on the medical technology industry. So there are huge implications for states like Minnesota that are heavy into medical technology companies as well as heavy into healthcare delivery. So we've got a lot of that that's going to unfold in the next few years as well.
And you think, the president says Obamacare is not on the table. What do you think?
I think it should be for this reason, because you have a huge challenge with our healthcare system. We know that we've got to begin to rein in the cost of healthcare generally. And I know Mayo Clinic has done a lot of work on this, and they've made a lot of sensible recommendations about how we could do that. That's our ultimate issue. But the budget deal, when we reach a budget deal, I think needs to include Obamacare, because this is a new federal entitlement program for health care that hasn't even, for the most part, gone into effect yet. And it's going to be increasingly expensive as it goes forward. And then we've got the Medicare program, which we know is one of the most expensive items in the federal budget. But Democrats in particular are going to face the proposition of which program do you want to make your savings in? Because we've got to find savings in the healthcare area. And I think they may decide to scale back some of what's being promised in Obamacare, which hasn't even gone into effect yet, as opposed to making even deeper cuts in the Medicare program. So I think the more items that are on the negotiating table, the better, because then we're more likely to reach a comprehensive and a balanced package of spending cuts and revenue to solve this budget problem.
In the last minute and a half, you and I and a lot of our viewers are worried about what's going to happen when our children, if they get jobs and when they retire from those jobs. What will be there for them? And you're saying they got to do something now. So
I think we have to do something now, because otherwise these programs are in real jeopardy. If we want any kind of a Social Security retirement program that provides any kind of a decent safety net, if we want any kind of a basic Medicare program for future retirees when our children get to that point, we need to do something to control the growth of these programs so that they are more affordable over time. Otherwise, we're going to end up doing two things, both of which will harm the next generation. We will cut back on the benefits in those programs while raising taxes on younger workers to pay for smaller programs. I think reforming those programs now and phasing those reforms in over time is the best way to assure that there's going to be some kind of a safety net for tomorrow's senior citizens.
I'm just speechless. Thank you.
Hey.
Thank you for giving us your assessment and your view of what you think will happen. And we want you to promise that you'll come back in January.
Every quarter. If you want me back, I'll be back.
And then tell us what we do after it's happened, after they've come to some
Yeah, we'll
conclusion.
see what they do before the end of the year and how big a deal they actually reach. But there'll be a lot to talk about in January.
No, because nobody knows how this is going to impact so many people, everybody, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they could just not reach an agreement, and then come January, we'll be talking about all the new taxes that are going into effect and all the new spending cuts that are going into effect. Not that they can't go into session in a few weeks and undo that.
Raise the debt ceiling, right?
But we don't want to go on a roller coaster ride like that.
Thank you for all the work you're doing with the Southern Minnesota Initiative Fund and all the good that you're doing for the people who live in Southern Minnesota. And thank you for sharing this information with our viewers.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you, our viewers, for being with us this week. We'll be with you again next week, same time, same channel. Stay tuned. It's only going to get more interesting. Have a good evening and a good night.